Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And it's the first time we've done a show at this particular time of day. So if you are a new viewer to World War II TV or you're catching your first live show, welcome aboard. Don't forget, all the information you always need is in the description below. And if you might consider becoming a patron or channel member, that would be very welcome. Anyway, welcome back to our Philippines week on the channel. My guest today, Marie Silva Vallejo, is a historian and author. Her latest book, Dauntless, is about the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiments, and I'm bringing her in. The links to buy that book are in the description below. So good afternoon, Marie. How are you today?
Hello, I'm fine. Thank you for having me on the show.
No, welcome. I'm glad you're here. So I like to ask people when they're kind of new to my channel how they define themselves, because some people think about themselves, define themselves as a historian of people. Other times it's more about a local aspect. Others, a military historian. So how would you define yourself as a historian?
I'm more like an accidental military historian, actually. Um, I did this on a personal basis, really, when I discovered that my father was part of this unit, especially the top secret unit. So, again, if I continue this on, we'll see. Probably then it'll be World War II.
Okay. And as we'll find out, it's the point of view you bring because you're from the area, because your father served, that is so unique. Because we were just chatting before going live. A lot of what I've read about the Philippines in World War II has been from the American point of view. It's American authors. It's not necessarily wrong. In fact, it's often very, very good. But it is from that point of view as the USA, which was a massive organization in World War II that spread its forces around the world. So it perhaps looked at the Philippines as a small contribution. But when you look at it from the Filipino angle, it's a massive contribution that encompassed, as we've talked about with Desiree and others, it encompassed the ground, the air, the sea, the navy, resistance, defiance. So it's a fascinating subject. So we'll bring up your PowerPoint, and folks, we will do questions at the end today. It'll be a much shorter presentation than James Zobel's mammoth 2.5 hours last night, which was amazing. But we'll be shorter today. So over to you, Marie, to take us through this fascinating story.
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you for having me so I can inform the world about this top secret group that came out of the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiment. Let's see. So the book Dauntless tells of the regiment's combat in the Philippines that was unknown until now. When I discovered that my father was a member of the unit and what the Filipinos went through in America before the war, I felt compelled to research and write about the unit. I wanted to tell about the intense racism and sacrifices the Filipinos, men at that time, suffered in the western states of California and Washington. At that time, restaurants posted signs of no Filipinos or dogs allowed. It was just the times then. The men could not be seen with a white woman, or they would be arrested or just lynched. But despite that, when war broke out, they volunteered to fight for America to remove the Japanese invaders from their motherland. It was not an easy task to write their story because the information on the men was scant and scattered in various archives. There were hardly any press photographers following the regiments in combat, unlike the other U.S. task forces. And in the Philippines, no one knew about the men. As for the secret group that returned on suicidal missions, it was rare to find information because the unit was mandated as top secret by General MacArthur. Who were these men? From all over the US, thousands of Filipinos volunteered to free their homeland when Pearl Harbor was suddenly attacked. Less than 10 hours later, the Philippines was attacked as a colony of America. Also, the Philippines was a doorway to the rich resources of Southeast Asia that Japan needed to maintain their war machines in the various countries they had already invaded. The men were greatly concerned with what will happen to their families in the islands. The President of the United States had to create the First Filipino Battalion and naturalize around 2,000 men as U.S. citizens to allow them to bear arms. Before the war, Filipinos were identified as aliens or naturals. The regiments arrived with the Allies' Luzon landing in January of 1945 and fought the enemy in the islands under the 8th Army. Some of the men went into the Alamo Scouts and participated in the Cabanatuan raid that freed 500 Allied prisoners of war and civilians. The men with the 6 Rangers helped free over 2,000 Allied civilians and soldiers in the Los Baños raid. Others were even assigned to units looking for General Yamashita. At the landings on Leyte and Luzon, the men with the civil affairs units followed behind the liberating forces, such as each island was liberated to feed the starving people, treat diseases, and give tools and equipment to plant and fish. They established hospitals, schools, and sanitation programs. It was a dangerous job because they were not to be in combat, but fighting was still ongoing, and civilians were rushing towards the liberating forces. With the counterintelligence unit, they hired local government officials to maintain security and justice until the local population and Commonwealth government could function and take over. Now let's go back. Before the Filipino and American troops in Bataan and Corregidor surrendered, General MacArthur was ordered by the President of the United States to leave for Australia to mount a campaign against Japan. When the Philippines surrendered, men refused to surrender, scattered to the mountains, or formed their guerrilla groups. For the next months, no communication was coming out of the islands until a faint radio signal of Colonel Guillermo Nacar, who was eventually captured and beheaded. But General MacArthur was ecstatic. Now he knew there was a resistance movement in the Philippines. Now he could plan for a successful return that would liberate the country and save the lives of the people and his own men. But how to execute such a plan? It took over 2 years to plan the return, while he was defending Australia from the advancing Japanese army. So how could MacArthur plan for a return if he was blind to what was happening in the islands? From the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiment, 800 men were interviewed and around 450 were chosen for the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion and 978 Signal Service Company radio men. Out of the 800 men interviewed, less than 100 were under 30 years old. They had been in the US for over 10 years. They were mostly Filipinos and they were called manongs, like older brother, who had been in the US for decades. They were trained in Australia to go on top secret submarine missions to the islands. This is a photo of some of the men training in Australia and New Guinea for the mission. They were suicidal missions and told that they might not come back, but the men were dauntless and still volunteered. The missions were kept so secret that submarine ships' logs listed the men as secret cargo. Many a times the men and submarine commanders did not know where they were heading to in the Philippines until the orders were opened at sea. Now the book tells of the missions from the men's reports and MacArthur's staff memos. They penetrated enemy lines and brought men, supplies, and radio to send back intelligence on the enemy. They were MacArthur's advance and his eyes and ears on the enemy, the guerrillas, and the people in the planning for his return to the Philippines on his way to Japan. The secret submarine missions began arriving only 6 months after the Corregidor surrender. The supplies they brought were never enough, but it kept the flames of resistance and the guerrillas' morale strong, no matter how sickly and starving they were, until liberation. Commander Charles Parson headed the Spiran missions that sent submarines with men and supplies to the Philippines. The Navy did not want their patrol subs to ferry men and supplies to the Philippines, which would take away from their main duty of sinking enemy ships in the seas between Japan and the Philippines. Parsons convinced the Navy to provide cargo submarines that carried more supplies, including propaganda and men, than patrol submarines. The signalmen would spot enemy ships from their strategic points on the islands and send the messages within minutes to the patrol submarines to sink. A confirmation of the hit seen by the signalmen was relayed immediately back within minutes, and the Navy would get the credit. So, of course, the Navy agreed. There were 20 submarines that landed mission men and evacuated personnel from the Philippines. 400 were on board the missions. 320 were Filipinos. But one submarine mission was lost, and unfortunately to friendly fire. The Seawolf was an obsolete operational sub that had been converted into a cargo sub. She had reached Manus Island off New Guinea, north of Australia, and exchanged radio signals with the guerrillas of their landing on Samar Island in the Philippines. But she was sunk with all 16 men on board, including 14 Filipinos. The destroyer escort, Rowell, not receiving a radio reply from Seawolf, fired Hedgehog, an anti-submarine weapon more deadly than depth charges, and sunk her. This is a map of the submarine missions to the various islands in the Philippines from the U.S. Military Intelligence Section. Submarines also landed on Negros and Cebu, which is not shown here. There were earlier landings. Although as the landing date on Leyte neared, trips were dangerous to the men on board as the submarines continuously traveled without refitting. The sub was loaded with fuel, men, and supplies and left the following day. They had to meet the tight deadline set by General MacArthur to prepare for his return. Only 1,627 tons were landed on the islands. The amount of cargo was limited with the capacity of the submarine and the number of men needed to operate the radios. But the sight of the cargo meant America did not forget. There was propaganda such as Hershey bars, chewing gum, matchboxes, Life magazines, even sewing needles and thread. The guerrilla commanders received special requests, such as shoe polish for their boots, then paste, butter, cheese, light bulbs. Whatever little sign from America kept their morale high and fighting. The Japanese would have won over the desperate and starving people if the men and supplies did not come. The island of Mindanao received the most cargo because it was the closest to Australia. It was also the distribution point of supplies to the other islands before submarines landed on those islands. Over 14,000 radio messages were sent to MacArthur's staff in Australia. Here's a bicycle-powered radio. Men worked in shifts on the bicycle while a man sent a message on the radio, and two others on the left and right stood guard to protect that radio. The guerrillas gathered intelligence on the enemy, and the mission men operated the radios. Mindanao again sent the most messages that it was closest to Australia, and radios from the other islands that could not reach Australia passed through Mindanao. The mission men were constantly on the run to protect the radio and continue sending messages on the location and disposition of the enemy. Most of the time, they starved, got sick with malaria, and suffered from jungle diseases. But they kept running from the enemy to protect and keep that radio on the air. One time, that radio on Mindanao was off the air when the men were discovered and immediately packed up to hide. MacArthur roared in several continuous messages that that radio was never ever to go down, and it never did for the rest of the war. As a result, the radio messages and maps on the enemy, the resistance, and the Filipino people significantly contributed to the planning of the Allies' return that saved lives. MacArthur had convinced President Roosevelt to liberate the Philippines first, instead of Formosa, now Taiwan, before proceeding to Japan. He strongly believed that the Filipino people would greatly suffer from the enemy's revenge if Formosa was taken first. Before I end my talk, I want to highlight that the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion and the 978 Signal Service Company were so secret that it was only in 1985 when the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, INSCOM, knew of the unit. And they were informed by a member of the battalion and not by the U.S. Army historian. INSCOM confirmed that it was the first and only Army units to undertake such a specialized mission during World War II. After the war, the men who returned and Filipinos living in the US were given better opportunities that were once unreachable to them. Many of the men returned with their brides or families since there were hardly any Filipino women, Filipinas, in the US at that time. So I thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope you will enjoy the book.
Well, thank you, and we'll have plenty of questions. It was informative stuff. I knew very little of this, so we'll start with a few questions about what you said. So the first thing is, you said, and I'm not doing this any order, I wrote them down. You said about the racism these guys faced. So that's whenever we have a show on this channel about African Americans serving or other indigenous people in the Canadian military, it seems to be the standard thing that they have to overcome the hurdles of just prejudice and lack of trust. Were there any particular things the Filipinos did, you think, that was perhaps different to how they approached racism? Did they try and win over the people who are being prejudiced towards them with proving themselves in training, or did they use humor, or did they try and was anything that you would kind of pinpoint as being the how they dealt with this?
You mean before the war, or when they were already
during
in the
the war,
military?
anything really?
Oh, before the war, it was
Yeah.
very difficult. It was very difficult for them. I read pages and pages of they were just not given opportunities for decent jobs. You had college professors and doctors who couldn't get a decent job, or even in the cities. So what they did was they worked in the fields, just picking apples, cutting asparagus, and so on. There were some of those who tried to escape, went into the city, and they worked as houseboys. They worked as houseboys or in the hotels, drivers to celebrities at that time, um, and some of them went back to school, college. Actually, my father was one of them who tried to escape and went back to school, college. Although he was already a teacher in Mindanao before he
Right.
arrived in the U.S. There were, yeah. So with that, I mean, I even found his 1935 school transcript. They sent it to me. The school had kept it. It was great. It was quite interesting.
No, definitely. And talking about how you found these archives, you said at the beginning how little information there was about this, and the fact that some of these documents weren't released till 1985. Were most of your sources found in the US or the Philippines, or both?
In the Philippines, they knew nothing of the men. I kept asking around, and everybody had said, no, General MacArthur or the Americans came back. That's it. That's all they knew. They did not know that there were any Filipinos who arrived earlier. And so, and the guerrilla records were very difficult to get to in the Philippines, because I thought maybe there would be an inkling that the guerrillas might talk about these men, but it was difficult to get that into in the Philippines. So I turned to the US and then just started first with the internet through my father's name in there. That was the first hit I got. It was in the MacArthur Library. That's where a lot of there were the 800 men. They had 3x5 cards for them when they interviewed them, and had little snippets on these men. And then finally they chose the 400 that was to be sent to Australia for training. Then from there, it was really a shotgun approach. From there, I said, okay, maybe the National Archives. There is in the National Archives, there are all the radio memos, the radio messages from the radio men in the Philippines that they sent to the US, to MacArthur. It's all signed, it's all there. So all of that, then you had to piece them all together. Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Historical Institute there, they had a background, also a background on the war, which helped. And it gave leads to where there could be more possible information. But the difficult part too was afterwards is piecing the story together. I wanted some more meat, so I wanted it from the point of view of the men themselves. So there was actually a thesis done about 30 years earlier by someone of the regiment, but he stopped at the war, and so I used that as a framework. From there, I said, what did they do in the Philippines? That was the missing part, so that had to be filled in, that missing part. And that's when it would have been nice to see the after action reports of the men, and to find the after action reports of the men in my appendix. I have, I think, about 40 or 50 of them that I finally found. That gives life to the book because it tells, I put in quotes, how they feel when they're there escaping the Japanese and running with the radio.
Well, brilliant. That's a thorough answer. So we've got a few questions from viewers now. So going back to the radios and I made my notes. The 14,000 messages sent. I'll put the that one up on screen again. We've got a message from Ian Carr. Did the Japanese have no seriously organized search technology for radio transmissions on the Philippines or for the Coast Watchers? So we've talked about the fact that they would send these messages. Did the Japanese do anything specifically to try and counter this? Did they even know these radio transmissions were going on?
They had an inkling, so they would send patrols over, and they have like triangulation. They would use triangulation, and so when the men would see that, I kind of felt that, then they would have to pack and hide. But yeah, the Japanese tried triangulation. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And the other one, going back to either the 1st and 2nd regiments or indeed the reconnaissance units, Lance is saying, were the regiments formed by provinces or dialects? Because, those of us who aren't from the Philippines, was it 3,500 islands and what have you? Did they try and organize, platoons and companies of people from the same areas, or was it kind of random?
No, what they tried to do most of the time was to choose men who would be going to a certain island and spoke the same language or dialect. Right. So it made it much easier. They could just blend in. Just like, I guess, the 442nd, you have the Japanese group. They sent them to Europe because then they would not be shot down because they look different. In the Philippines, they use it another way to blend in with the people and to be able to do their job.
Okay, thank you. And then you touched on this, but Rick Green is wanting to know a bit more. You talked about the fact that after the war, there's a little bit more recognition of what the Filipino contribution was. So Rick is saying, did this service have any effect on the Filipinos' political status in the US after the war?
I guess there was just a bit more recognition in the sense that since now it was kind of known during the war that they fought side by side, brother to brother on Bataan. And then these men, afterwards, knowing about these men, yes, they were given a bit more opportunities, but it wasn't like 100% across the board. There were still some who probably just didn't get that opportunity and went back to the fields. I visited some of them with my dad, and I was living with my father.
Okay, thank you. And the next thing is, and this is more of a kind of almost a philosophical question. Whenever we have a show on this channel about special forces or covert operations, it's often very difficult to measure the success of them. I'm thinking particularly about the early British raids of 1940-41, where the results were very, very mixed, but there is this sort of idea that it improves morale. Now, with the, you stressed that MacArthur is planning his invasion in 45 with this information from the reconnaissance units. We've already done shows on the channel about the Alamo Scouts. You talked about MacArthur appreciating this. At the time, if you were an American leading a battalion landing in Luzon in 45, do you think you were aware of where that information had come from? That it had come from Filipino native indigenous people who'd come back to the island doing this work, or do you think they thought it was the US doing it? Do you think there was recognition at the time? Is basically my question.
I don't think there was recognition at the time because it was all top secret.
Yeah.
All the messages were marked top secret. I mean, I saw them. The documents at the National Archives, marked top secret, top secret. So I said, even their training camp in Brisbane and New Guinea was top secret.
No, that's interesting. And then the next thing is you talked about these men in the reconnaissance battalion being a bit older. They were the kind of older brother figures, 10 years older. Was there a reason for that? Is it because they were the ones that were living in the US, or did they want older people because of kind of experience or stability? What was the reasoning for having some people who are a bit older?
They've been in the US for decades. They had jumped ship from the Philippines to the US for a better life or whatever, for whatever reason. And so, but they were relegated to the fields. When the war breaks out, they all volunteered still, even though with all that racism. And so they were much older. They were in their 30s. Of the 800 that was interviewed, less than 100 were under 30 years old.
Wow.
My dad was 33.
Wow. And talking of your dad, Susan Yu, who's a regular viewer, is saying, What did your dad say about his time in the unit? I mean, was he obviously you must have known a little bit about it, but was he chatty about it, or did things come out from him, on a very kind of a rare basis?
I wish I talked to him more about this.
Yeah,
I regret it. Maybe I should have given him more a chance. Maybe it was the age gap. And I was a teenager, and he was already in his 50s.
right.
And I guess, yeah, I really regret it. But I'm talking to the descendants now also, because I got some of the information from the descendants. It was the same thing. Their fathers hardly talked about it. They just wanted to forget it. And some of their fathers still had, I guess, the residuals from the war. That they still have the, from I guess, for the diseases of the jungles and so on. And they wanted to understand. And then the father, about the jungle rot and everything that they underwent, but wanted to forget it. A lot of them say, I wish I talked more to my father. Also, another thing was that when I was given this talk, a lot of them came back to me and said, so what my father said was true, Marie. He was on a submarine. You see, because they're talking to an 80-year-old man, and they're thinking the guy is just making this up now.
If you didn't know anything about it, it would sound fantastic, wasn't it? I was put into a secret unit by MacArthur, and we went by Sudbury. People would think, yeah. Granddad's been on the bottle again. It does sound crazy.
Exactly. I had been getting a lot of that. So with that, they're looking at the book. It's like a Bible. This is proof what father said or granddad said. And I feel good when I hear that.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's interesting. So another question from Ian Carr, and this is more about the Philippines themselves, is how many of the Philippines islands were the Japanese have permanently occupied during the war?
Would the Japanese have permanently occupied? Yeah. Actually, most of them were in Manila, Luzon. Yeah. Most of them were in Luzon. Okay. The outer islands, they had, smaller units. They had smaller units in the other islands. So, and then from what I had read, the Japanese liked to stay within the city. They didn't like to go out because they were afraid of the guerrillas. This is true, especially in Mindanao, where it says like the guerrillas ruled the countryside. So the Japanese were always in the cities. And there were other anecdotes, which I have in the book there, what they talk about the Japanese, of how noisy they are when they go on patrol. And so maybe, as they say, they're saying this, maybe it's to scare us off, to tell them that, hey, we're coming, so go away, things like that. It's interesting.
Well, that is interesting because we as Brits, we are taught to think that the Japanese were the masters of jungle warfare. The stories that came out of Malaya and Singapore, the early part of the wars, they were the ones who were naturally at home in that climate, and the British and the Commonwealth forces struggled to get as good as the Japanese were in that regard. And you're saying in the Philippines that they could hear them coming. That's an interesting perspective, but yeah. Yeah, and another question, which I don't expect I know what the answer is. Kevin Jones is saying, I know it doesn't compensate for all they went through, but were any medals struck for their service? So some of these men, did they receive anything from the US, or did they receive any recognition for the Philippines themselves?
I think the first reconnaissance in the 978, from all the research, they received the Bronze Star Medal. But right. there was an incident wherein it could have been a higher medal. But I'm not going to speak more on it. It's more of a higher up, whatever, happening, right? But they received Bronze Stars. Yeah.
Okay, and my next question is about. I mean, it's a standard interviewer's question to someone who's written a book. But what are your hopes for the book? Because I mean, you have done lots of talks in the US, in the Philippines as well. But obviously, you want this story to be known wider. It's not just if people contact you from the Philippines and say, yes, that must have been my granddad's unit, that must have been the unit my great uncle talked about, but there's a wider recognition across the board that I think you'd appreciate, because I'm sure most Americans, Australians, and British watching this didn't realize the extent of the Filipino involvement. So is that you would like this story to be better known across the world?
Oh, definitely. Filipinos' contribution, the guerrillas' contribution, and the civilians who helped the guerrillas, so that these radio men coming from Australia would be able to do their work. I mean, it wasn't 100%, nice coordination, but still, there is a contribution.
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, I said at the beginning of the show how important it is that we realize that the Philippines was liberated by both U.S. and also Filipino
Mhm.
contributions themselves. So, any other things about the makeup of the first and second regiments that you think is unique? When we talk about different units on the channel coming up, more raised units. Was there a kind of obviously having esprit de corps because they are all from the same country? But anything other unique aspects about the regiments that you think is important?
Well, they had to be created as a special group to bear arms, that's for sure. And then from that regiment, it was the first generation of Filipinos, about over 2,000 of them, that was naturalized as American citizens. So that's actually the first wave that started all the Filipinos with American citizenship and so on. Um, the they had a good the reputation in the army was pretty good in that sense, because they're how do you call the place where they put the soldiers when they have infractions was always empty.
Right.
When
Okay. Yeah.
it
Okay.
was always empty, so they were considered good soldiers, and they had their own mess. Unlike the U.S. armies, Sixth Army, Eighth Army, they had to share a mess. They had their own mess, so they could cook their own Filipino food and
That's
their own medical detachment.
okay. Thanks for that. And I think you've answered this question. So the officers in the battalions, would they have been naturalized Americans who were formerly Filipino? Is that who the officers were?
The officers of the regiment,
Yeah.
okay, they had officers that were there were
Right.
Caucasian men there too, as for training the men, and where there were what do you call it now, higher officers.
Yeah.
Then their like second in command would be a Filipino officer, and a lot of them started off. They were West Pointers. They were Filipino West Pointers that were caught in the war in the U.S. So they were actually the one of the first officers. And then as more were trained, more were given the responsibility to become officers.
Okay, I think I was reading last night actually about the first Filipino graduate at West Point was 1913, something like that. I believe it was much earlier than I thought it was going to be. It was either 13 or 14. It was right just before the outbreak of the Great War was the first graduate from there. But we will bring things to an end fairly soon. But any other kind of hopes you have for this book, or anything you'd like it to lead to? I mean, there's obviously, as we're finding out with Philippines Week, there's a lot more Philippines history that is yet to be discovered, yet to be expanded upon. So is there another project you'd like to work on, or do you think this will lead to?
I think I'd like to rest after this, but I just my hope is that the Filipino contribution to World War II be appreciated and be known more. That's basically it.
Okay, thank you. We've got one more question for you from Rick again, because you talked about the increased recognition for those who went to the US, but what about those who returned to the Philippines after all? Rick is saying, were the men away from the Philippines for a long period? Did they encounter challenges adapting to going back to the Philippines? Did some go back home and find it difficult to adjust?
Yes, there were some men who did go back to the U.S. because they had been away for so long, for decades. And so, yeah, I did read that, that they decided to return and said that the U.S. is now my home.
Right. Okay.
So, again, it's how you adapt. Yeah.
Well, I think that adaptability is the key thing here. The people from the Philippines wanted to do something for the war effort, and some who couldn't leave stayed and did what they could from within the islands. Others who were living outside or could escape did what they could, and it's the range of things that they were doing to help the war effort. I think we're learning from this week. So well, we'll
Yes.
bring things to an end. Good luck with the book, folks. The link to purchase the book is to Marie's website in the description below. And I'm back again tomorrow. We're talking about the Filipino collaborators, the Makapili, with Marissa tomorrow. So we'll do that then. And thanks for watching, everybody. Thank you, Marie, and thank you. I'll see you all again. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.